because of the time change and all that, there may be, and because moving around the campus is so difficult, that there may be some people on the way here, but in the interest of time, I think we should start. It's really a great pleasure to have Professor Kashani-Sabet, Firoozeh, with us. I have followed her work, her scholarship, her involvement in issues related to Iranian culture and life for a long time, and I have always admired the fact that she has brought a very even-keeled, cool-headed approach to studying culture and history and life, at the same time that she has always spoken about what she thinks should be spoken without any hesitation. Her work, her printed, published work is all known. I'm going to ask my colleague, Dr. Mir-Djalali Mousavi, to do a better introduction of her. I just wanted to say that it's really a personal, great pleasure for me to welcome her to College Park, and I hope it would be one of many other visits in the future. So, thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Here is a short bio that Professor Kashani-Sabet sent to us. Dr. Kashani-Sabet is a Walter H. Amber Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of Frontier Fiction, Shaping the Iranian Nation, 1999, and Conceiving Citizens, Women and the Politics of Motherhood in Iran, 2011, and a novel, A Martyrdom Street. Her research concerns identity politics, including race, ethnicity, and gender. For her significant contribution to the field, I recommend check her profile and the university. This is a very short bio. I'm very much honored to welcome you, and please join me in welcoming Dr.
So thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's such a pleasure and such an honor for me to be here at the University of Maryland with such an august professor, Professor Kashani-Sabet, and Professor Mousavi and Dr. Mustafa and everyone. You know, it's such an incredible program that you've built here again under the leadership of Professor Kashani-Sabet and all the colleagues that are here today, and many who are not able to be here as well. So I just want to convey my enormous gratitude first for your extremely warm and generous hospitality, but more importantly for all your efforts on behalf of Iranian studies and Middle Eastern studies, you know, and ways in which you've helped keep the field so grounded and so vibrant, often under very difficult circumstances, financially, politically, culturally, and otherwise. So I don't want to be remiss in not acknowledging the incredible program that you've built here and are continuing to develop here. I want to give a special thank you again to Dr. Kashani-Sabet and also to Dr. Mousavi. I have been showered with so much generosity since my arrival yesterday in the middle of, you know, torrential rains. But I'm glad to say, you know, that the sun has, you know, has followed me here. I don't know from where, because where I came from was also raining. But hey, you know, the universe is smiling upon us, and that's always a good thing. And I'm especially grateful because I know today we had a couple of challenges, as Dr. Kashani-Sabet said. We had daylight savings, which never saves any of us from, you know, our missteps. In fact, it seems to contribute to them. But also I'm competing with the Oscars. So, you know, so I gotta be really grateful for all of you who've shown up. So I'll try to make it, you know, worth your while. I don't know if I can compete with Barbenheimer or Oppenheimer or whatever, but you know, this is actually a really important question. So thank you again for your time. So the title of my talk is Making It Count: Women in the Suffrage Movement in Iran. In light of everything that has happened with women, the story of women, and the questions that continue to surround the empowerment, of women politically, I think it's an important moment for us to kind of go back and focus on the question of the vote and suffrage. Because it is part and parcel of a longer conversation about power. Ultimately, it does come down to power, to two things, power and patriarchy. And so my talk is really much framed in that kind of very broad context. Hello.
Oh, I believe it's backwards for some
Upside
reason.
down?
Let me,
I don't think it's upside down.
Both arrows sometimes.
Okay.
so
I have to turn it.
try it.
No, it works.
No, that was me. Try it now, and I believe it should work. Sorry.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
there we
right.
go.
I need the down arrow. Okay. I kept going up and I should have been going down. All right. So, I think it's important to keep in mind that, when we talk about the vote, women and the right to vote, or more generally universal suffrage, so not just women, this was a global movement that had really kind of gained traction in the late 19th century, and really into the 20th century. And so we see that, first, it began with ideas of universal male suffrage, which if you go back to the French Revolution, for a brief period that was enacted there. And then, just for the purposes of this talk, I found a couple of other dates that I want to throw out there. For example, Haiti had instituted universal male suffrage, I believe, in the early 1800s, 1816 is the date that I have. But the first sort of attempt to give women a right to vote was in New Zealand. However, many of the places that did originally give women some degree of involvement in the voting process and in the political process was often restricted. So we see, for example, even in the United States, when the 19th Amendment passed, in 1920, the centenary of which we celebrated about 4 years ago, it was restricted because African Americans and others, were not able to vote, so questions of citizenship had to be renegotiated. It was not until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, that these restrictions were removed. And so women, of different racial backgrounds were also able to participate. Canada actually gave the right to vote to women in 1918, so before the United States had done so. Finland in 1906, which was, it was still an autonomous part of the Russian Empire. They actually gave unrestricted sort of or universal suffrage in that time period. So you can see that the larger point I'm trying to make is that this was a concept and a political movement. Yeah, that was that had gained traction increasingly in many different parts of the world. And it did tend to be mostly in the West, but then it kind of expanded to other places as well. And so part of what we see here too is that this was coupled with conversations about women's activism, women's increasing role in society. So suffrage was one major goal, but along with that came a whole lot of other desiderata for women, not only in the United States or Europe, but elsewhere. And we see that in the sort of the incipient suffrage movement in Iran as well. Going down. Can I just say next slide?
Yes. Apologies.
So the next slide is really, as you know, so Iran in the 19th century was moving toward sort of ideas of governance, having more sort of governance control of, or sort of restricting the power of the sovereign, of the Shah in this sort of time period. And so, and yet we begin to see sort of grassroots activism. You all know this history if you're familiar with the history of Iran. It begins with the sort of the tobacco regime, and then sort of moving on into the period that we call the Constitutional Revolution, where there's a lot of activism again. Certain things sort of come into play. One is there's a sense of sort of the need to sort of control foreign involvement in the affairs of Iran. Back then, oil had not been found, so we can't say oil was a part of it. But the customs, the control of customs by foreigners in Iran was one of the sparks of the 1906 revolution. And as we know, this was a movement, and the reason why it's called a revolution, and I do think it really was, is because it involved so many different classes of society in this time period, including women. Women, for the first time, published newspapers for women and about issues, and they were not necessarily radical, and they were not necessarily editorialized pieces. So there wasn't, you don't often read long sort of dispositions about suffrage, for example, but they were about, they were often articles intended to improve the lot of women socially. So, how, women interacted in the family, over child care issues and so forth. Now, as we know, the Iranian Constitutional Revolution was a major event also because we have the first written constitution, right? I love this picture. I always show it in my lecture classes because I'm like, look at them. I mean, there's no women. Where are they? They're not here. And yet we know that women, were very involved in the Constitutional Revolution. And so this is the first, I would say, on the one hand, it was the first setback for women because they were so involved in it and they were so interested in being part of this movement. And yet they were denied the right of kind of participation on very sort of pejorative grounds that women lack the mental capacity really to be allowed to, vote and to shape the polity. And so what we're left with then in the Constitutional Revolution, which is also very similar to the Ottoman constitutional period as well, is that, we celebrate it on the one hand as this moment where enfranchisement of limited enfranchisement comes to these societies, and that's a good thing. But it was so limited that in a way it really restricted what could be attained socially. And we see that really in the struggles of modern Iran, for example, for greater political participation or a desire for the polity to be much more active socially, politically in this. The other thing that I wanted to sort of emphasize, and it should be emphasized, is that part of the reason why women in this time period, despite all the revolutionary things that they did, and I do think it was revolutionary, I think it was revolutionary for women to, to try to publish journals. I think it was revolutionary for women to organize societies, Anjuman, to address the needs of women, to try to create, for example, sewing classes or whatnot, other types of small schools, limited in enrollment for sure. But the fact that there was this desire and success, limited success, where these things were happening, I think is quite remarkable in this time period. But really going back to the late 19th century, for example, Mirza Khan in his newspaper, Roshan, there was constantly a debate about how much male guardianship women needed, particularly where education was concerned. Because, the country lacked female teachers, for example, right? Now, how is this going to take place? How is this going to happen? How are we going to help this process along? And so this idea that women needed this male guardianship or protection, I think is really very much endured. I wanted to say something a little controversial, and we can talk about it in question and answer, which is that, sometimes, like the male guardianship, it was very much there because it was, of course, a male-dominant society, politically and otherwise, like power in terms of power differential. But, sometimes the men actually were supporting the women in these causes as well. And I think that, not always, many times they were not, as I said, they were also sort of denied. But I think that it's hard to just kind of have a sort of a stereotypical view that there was a lot of, synergy sometimes, particularly some of the younger representatives that we see here. And as we know, one of the things that was happening in this time period was the writing of the electoral laws. And it was in the process of the writing of electoral laws that Raya, he argued very sort of vociferously for women in this time period. His entreaties were actually picked up by English language newspapers. It was written about, it was repeated in many newspapers in the early constitutional period. Sayed Hassan Atali says it was another one young man at that point, a young politician who would go on to have a very sort of storied career, assuming many, many different posts within the Iranian government over time as a diplomat and so forth. But he was also one of the early figures in this time period that supported women's suffrage. But as I said, it was not possible. It didn't happen. And I think this picture really is so, I can never really get my eyes off of it because it really, this was like just over 100 years ago. I mean, that's not that long ago when you think about it. So the reason why we see the struggle for women is so charged still in Iran, I think goes back to some of these fundamental cultural issues that have been really hard to shape, in terms of the sort of the position of women and what their role should be in the public sphere.
Great.
So, in the period of the First World War, we don't have a whole lot of information about what was happening. We know that there was tremendous suffering for the Iranian population. We know that, I've said it in many other talks as well, but it bears repeating here too. Iran was very much of a failed stage during the First World War. We didn't have a functional central government. We had a king who was a teenager who didn't really know what he was doing. He didn't take himself seriously. Nobody took him seriously. He then went to Europe. It was kind of a mess. We had the Ottomans invading from the northeast even before the Constitutional Revolution. We had the Russian troops that had been there since 1911, the ultimatum that was given to Schuster. We have, the British creating their own sort of armed, armed service, military service in the South. We have the Swedes and the gendarmerie. We have the Germans by. I mean, this is a country that's sort of like, whatever. And then we have a rival government in Iran. So, things were really kind of very difficult. And it was very difficult for women too, because we had all kinds. But there were many, many other types of weekly diseases that were being cataloged by some of the missionary doctors and other doctors in this time period.
I'm sorry, can I stop you for one second? So okay, let me just, can you hear us online? Please, feel free to go on, and I apologize again for the interruption.
No worries. Are we audible now?
Hopefully, yes, I've got to.
We have to get verification from the audience.
Yes.
Yes, okay, great, we are good to go.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Yeah. So we're just getting out of the First World War. So again, we had a country here that's kind of a mess. And immediately after, of course, there are, that there's the coup d'etat of 1921, February 1921. But remarkably, it's within those years, you see the 1299, which is the year of the coup, right? Remarkably, in this time period, we also begin to see again, literary work by women for women, which I think is really quite remarkable. And this actually, I found this here in the United States. So the other thing I want to encourage everyone to do, as I do in every one of my talks, is really to, recognize that some of these important, really valuable historical sources are at our fingertips here in the United States. And they should really be used by as many scholars who want to, are interested, and would have access to them. Yeah, so this was one of the, journals. The next slide, please. And then we also have, shortly thereafter, a society that's created, which is called Jamiyat Niswan Batakha, the Society for Patriotic Women. And there are some of the, very remarkable women. The mother of Sabit is also here. And so, so some of the, sort of the women pioneers of this time period really sort of help lead this cause. And you can also find, next slide, please. They also have a newspaper that is published by the society, which is called Mir-Djalali Jamiat Muslimat Iran, which is a couple of years, just about 3 years or so, around 3 years after the coup by Reza Khan at that time period. And so you see that a lot of the things that they emphasize here are, as they point out, they say etni adabi ijtimai, but really it's mostly social, it's mostly ijtimai, about the condition of women, and also women serving as advocates for other women. I think that's such an important part of this history, is how women step in to be advocates for other women. And I do want to say that, yes, this is very much of an elite kind of thing. So most of the women in this time period did come from prominent families of means, but they were also women who wanted to use that privilege to try to sort of, expand literacy and expand access to better health care for women, encouraging women to kind of take charge more of their choice of, say, spouse later on in the interwar period. So the role of women serving as activists for women really can't be underestimated in this time period. And one of the causes, of course, was also suffrage, which took a much longer time to come to fruition for reasons that I mentioned briefly, but I will continue to talk about. Yes, next slide, please. So one of the things that happens is, as I said, so we begin to see after the First World War, remarkably, that among the first kind of sort of blossoms of rejuvenation and rebirth are through these women's journals that I just showed, the pictures of to you. And this kind of continues in the interwar period. Once there's a little bit of calm and there's a respite from war after, the 1920s and early 30s. And one of the things that happens is Iranian women, along with women in other parts of the Middle East, particularly Arab dominant parts of the Middle East, they also begin to partake of these congresses that speak to suffrage and women's rights more globally. And one of the most remarkable things that happens is that the Eastern Women's Conference was convened in Damascus, Syria, in July of 1930, and it was chaired by a Lebanese activist, Noor Hamida, and the Congress brought many prominent women's rights activists, not from the Middle East, but from other parts of the world, to the region. And then 2 years later, Tehran also hosted the second Eastern Women's Congress, which was held from November 27th to December 2nd of 1932. And this is from one of the newspapers from the time period that talks about, what happened there, including, Noor Hamida, who was also there, and, some of the other sort of things that the issues that came up in that time period, the program and so on. And you can see that among the sort of the goals of prominent themes were suffrage, education, literacy, hygiene, marriage, and particularly divorce laws for women. This is also a time, by the way, in the Middle East, just because I'm looking at you, Turkey has also become very active in promoting sort of many secular laws and ideals for women. And women in Turkey actually gained the right to vote in 1934, which was really remarkably early when you think about it. So, you know, the women's congresses, I think, I would argue, really play an important role in connecting Iranian women and Middle Eastern women to larger sort of networks of global activism, or sort of, I don't know how global they were, but sort of more sort of outside the region, international activism on the issue of suffrage and also women's rights more generally. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so, oh, and of course, I should have mentioned this. Of course, the most controversial thing that happens before the First World War is the mandatory unveiling of Iranian women that takes place in 1936. And I didn't put it here because it's always mentioned, you know, and it is an important thing. But it was a mandatory kind of legislation that lasted for 5 years, pretty much. And it was very sort of unevenly executed, but we have a lot of documentation, both in Persian sources, and also in foreign language sources, American diplomatic records, British diplomatic records, of a lot of resistance to the way in which the mandatory unveiling of women was being kind of enacted. That there was real discomfort that a lot of women faced. But there were also women, younger women, who did like it. Like, I do want to point out that, you know, we also have reports within those same diplomatic sources, not the Iranian ones that have been published, but in foreign diplomatic sort of renderings of what was going on in Iran in that time period, that there were some, you know, it did allow young women to go to offices as stenographers, for example. It allowed office spaces, government office spaces, to be more sort of gender mixed in this time period in the way that they had not been. But it was, you know, one of the things that I think has to be acknowledged too is, particularly in this time period, you know, you didn't really have upward mobility if you kind of had a veil and you sort of looked very distinctly more religious, you know what I mean? And so those were the limitations and kind of the controversy of that decree. When Reza Shah abdicated the throne, Mohammad Reza Shah, of course, he comes to power. He too was a young Shah in this time period, not necessarily an experienced statesman at all. And Iran was under occupation. I mean, it's another one of my sort of another one of the sort of themes of my current research is Iran and the Second World War. I always say that because my mother was born in the Second World War. My family's from Iran, so my grandparents always had memories of, you know, Russians being in the streets of Rasht, you know, in that time period. My uncle, who was like 7 or 8 years old, he remembers the sugar rations. Like, you know, you're a kid, you can't have access to sugar. You're going to remember that, you know, things like that. And so, you know, the Second World War, I think, was such a trauma for Iran, really. It was such a dramatically, like, it's just a troubling kind of thing. Because, you know, it's not just that there's restriction, it's that it's being imposed by external powers within the country. And and it's also something that you never really hear much mention of in European classes. And in another talk, I sort of argued, and I want to reiterate it here, because I think it's important that it should be incumbent on us, those of us who study Iranian history, to sort of kind of push our colleagues who study the world wars, but do it from a European angle, really to kind of begin to talk about the impact of the war in non-European settings, even though I understand that the main battles were where they were. But nonetheless, I mean, I think when you look at it, this was a really very difficult time for Iranians because there was a lot of poverty too. And many women actually reverted to reveiling. So that's also very telling that 5 years after that decree had been cast or imposed, Iranian women, many of them, and particularly in the provinces, decided to go back to veiling themselves. And this was actually mentioned by a lot of the United States consuls that were in Iran serving during the Second World War. So this is not necessarily people who, like the veil, but they certainly noticed it, you know what I mean? That there had been this choice to kind of be veiled for many. Not everyone, but for many. And again, the other thing that was very evident was there was so much poverty, that, that even children, like I found several documents that I cited in a fairly recent article, when the children didn't have enough clothing to wear in the streets. They were so hungry, like one of the American consuls was saying, when I first came here, the sound of hearing children cry was so loud. And I always wondered, he said, I wondered like if it was because Iranian parents are terrible at parenting their children, and you realize that they're really very hungry, that these are pangs of hunger for Iranian children. So I think that, occupation is one thing when you look at it simply from a diplomatic or political perspective. But again, when you look at what it means socially for people on a day-to-day basis, for the most vulnerable and the poor, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done still to bring this to public attention, and how this country really just sort of suffered in these two world wars. And then the other thing is that as this was also happening, the Second World War, as we know, was also a period of political openness in Iran. A lot of new political parties were created. The Tudeh party came into existence. Tudeh or masses, which is basically the Communist Party, came into existence in 1941. And it organized a women's association, Tashilat Zanon. And then there were high-profile women such as Mayam Firouzeh, who was an activist, had joined the Tudeh party. And, in her memoirs, somebody asked her, or she mentioned, has this little interview that's there. And they said, why did you want to be participatory in this way? And she said to her, the Tudeh party offered the only viable path to political participation of women as equals, even though we know that there was an equality within a lot of these leftist organizations. May I have the next slide, please? Yeah. So there was that. And then, so right after the war, of course, there's the creation of the United Nations, which is also very, very significant in this path towards suffrage, because when the UN was created, it renewed momentum on the question of women's suffrage worldwide. And of course, that included Iran, because Iran was one of the original member states of the United Nations. And it also recognized and voted in favor of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which had been adopted in 1948. And Article 21 of the Declaration states the following: the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, and shall be held by secret vote or by the equivalent free voting or by equivalent free voting procedures. So, this was also a significant thing because globally, again, there's a recognition and an embrace of, universal suffrage rights, which included not just women, but also many disenfranchised indigenous populations, people who had been subjected to racial discrimination and were deprived of these voting, laws that had been passed in many, many countries, including in the West. So this was happening. And then at the same time, we know, so it's also after the war in 1949 that Arab women in Syria won voting rights in 1949. So Iran was kind of beginning to really lag a lot of countries on this front. And then, of course, immediately after the war, within 6 years, the issue of oil nationalization really dominates public discourses. I mean, that becomes Iran's big fight for economic independence. But one thing that people forget is this is also a moment when Iranian women really, once again, clamored to win the right to vote. And they appealed, if I can have the next slide, please. They really appealed to the Mossadegh, the left, women's, and sort of to promote women's rights. In January of 1952, the Women's Organization of Iran forwarded to the General Secretary of the United Nations their objections against legal barriers to women's suffrage in Iran. And so the question really in 1952 really dominated domestic news. It was really part and parcel of the fight for Iran's sort of soul and also Iran's independence. So on the one hand, there's a war for, there's a battle for, not a war, a battle for economic independence. But at the same time, there is a battle for, this really crucial social fight to give women the right to vote. And we know that Dr. Mossadegh in theory was in favor of it, and there were electoral laws that were being revised in this time period, but women ultimately did not get the right to vote. The other thing too, that we see that is very, very significant, and here I love this, this is from one of the new publications from this time period in the 50s. And this is sort of a celebration by the women's organization on the anniversary of the Constitutional Revolution. I show this because it stands in such stark contrast to the first image that I showed from 1906, where there was no women. And yet 50 some years later, or almost 50 years later, you can see that women are such sort of, even if it was somewhat forced, or to some extent, some might have felt that it was obligatory, still, I think you choose to kind of sit somewhere, like you guys are choosing to be here. And maybe it's partly, you feel obligation too, right? It's kind of both, right? You feel a little obligation, but you're obligated because you've decided to be a part of something, right? And I think that, and we see this in this picture, which I really think is really fabulous. And one of the other things I wanted to point out is that, both in my previous book, The Conceding Citizens, and in the work that I do as just a mentor, as someone who is professional. I also, as someone who, had their training in the West, particularly on women's history and feminism and so on. I also, kind of give a pushback. I know that motherhood isn't always embraced. It's always viewed as a very sort of conservative thing, sort of a traditional thing. And one of the things that I try to do in Conceding Citizens is actually kind of to give a pushback to that, and to be, to sort of give women who wanted to be sort of at the forefront of social change also the opportunity to embrace their identity as mothers, that it wasn't an either or thing. It didn't have to be a binary. And so we really see this in this time period that, sort of women really kind of embrace motherhood, but it's like motherhood that has so much like character and punch to it. You sort of just want to hug these women and be like, yeah, I'm with you. And so there were a lot of, there was a lot of conversation about it. And so it really didn't die down. So in some ways I would say, that was kind of a really important change that happened because of oil nationalization, that the increasing political activism, awareness, and involvement of women. And in the sort of the dramas, political dramas of the country was very, very significant. So after 1954, and after the oil nationalization, it was a success on the one hand, but as we know, it was also very restricted. It wasn't complete nationalization and independence. But anyway, whatever it was better than it had been. And so in 1954, there were only 60 member states in the United Nations that had given women the right to vote on an equal footing with men. So still, there was a lot of work to be done worldwide. 6 other countries at that time had enabled limited voting, while 17 other countries, which included Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Yemen, were among and a handful of Latin American countries. And they really hadn't made much progress on this front. And in Iran, of course, the situation was compounded by a sense of cynicism, because as we know, when the Shah was sort of ensconced on the throne as a result of the coup, he sort of lost his legitimacy. He lost his legitimacy, not only in the eyes of the people, I think, as a leader too. He didn't really know how to lead anymore because, it's a hard thing to do, right? After such a situation. And so one of the things that does happen with, frequency is that elections were always often rather held in abeyance, or they were suspended, or they were manipulated. And so there was a lot of cynicism when the issue of voting came up, that, voting mattered little in a country that didn't really have political freedom. Like, why are you fighting for suffrage when, people who can actually vote, well, their votes aren't even counting, right? I mean, that's a bad argument. It's not like the one I'm supporting. I'm just telling you what the thinking was for some people. And there was a patriarchal climate as well, sorry. There was a patriarchal climate in which, women were given or sort of people who were activists on behalf of women's suffrage were given the cold shoulder, on this front. And so, yeah. Yes, can I have the next one, please? So within this, sort of climate of uncertainty of a Shah and his second term that, as we know, was much more restrictive in terms of, much more dictatorial in his demeanor. We know that there's also a change between Iran's relations and the United States, of course. The Kennedy administration comes in, there's more emphasis on Iran kind of pursuing social reforms. Though I also say that I think that there was also a move globally towards some social progressive causes, such as suffrage, as we saw. But a part of the White Revolution, which was unveiled very controversially in 1961, there were a lot of people who were opposed to it. Many landowners were opposed to it. Many members of the religious classes were opposed to it, particularly because it did, give women the way toward earning the right to vote, which actually took place in 1963. And it wasn't just that women could vote, women could also serve in parliament. That was the part that bugged conservatives the most. It's one thing to have women, okay, you want to cast a vote, go right ahead. It's another thing to put women in charge, even a little bit, as political leaders in the country, giving them the authority to debate legislation that affected everybody, which meant that it affected men. And that was a hard sell for many who, didn't like it, particularly dissenting ulama. And this is well documented, of course, and then it leads to, as you know, a series of uprisings in June of 1963, and so we see that this tug of war kind of going back to the first constitutional period, the first Majlis of Iran, or first two Majlises of Iran, where, the issue of how much right women should have, how much control should be over women, never really dies out. And it continues to animate and to sort of get in the way of women really being fully participatory in the country. Concluding remarks. So I think that when we look at anywhere, not just Iran, when you look at the history of suffrage, when you look at the suffrage, really, what does it mean? It's also about inclusion. When we talk about suffrage, why is it important? It's important because we want to be more inclusive. It's important because we want more voices to count. It's important because we want more voices to matter. It's important because we want the country, any country, including this one, to have an election season before us, right? It's important because you want to, give people a chance to shape the future, whatever that future is, right? And I think that, one of the things that we see continually is also incredible competition in the political and economic spheres for these rights, and maybe that's to be expected. People are going to compete for position, people are going to compete for influence, but it should, I think, be a fair competition. And it hasn't always been a fair competition in Iran, not only for women, but also for many minorities as well. I will also say, though, that I think Iran is quite remarkable in its first constitutional experiences by allowing seats for religious minorities in its constitution at a time when Western, nations that had parliamentary bodies really were not acknowledging people in that way that Iran was, or that the Ottoman period, the Ottomans were. However limited, however problematic it was, I still think it's remarkable. That didn't happen in the Russian Empire. That didn't happen in Britain. And so I think that, you know, there were some really important, there were some very important precedents that were established in this history. But the attempt to try to bring women and make them a part, an equal part of this, really has been very, very kind of contested. And it does ultimately go back to power and the persistence of patriarchy in the Iranian society. I do think that there is incredible resistance societally in acknowledging women as equal partners, whether it's in academia, whether it's you know, whether it's in the home. And I'm not saying this is universally true, but it's true enough and it's ingrained enough that even after over 100 years of having these conversations, we see that women's rights, not only in Iran, but worldwide, the right to an abortion, you know, all of these have been very, very politicized, and the people taking them away from women more often than not tend to be men. Thank you very much.